Mr. President, a free, independent press is vital to our democracy. It's enshrined in our Constitution. We need tenacious, dedicated journalists who will afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted, to ask tough questions, to challenge special interests, to connect Americans with their communities. That's why I joined my colleagues this week on a resolution condemning this administration's awful, vicious, demagogic attacks on reporters, from the decision last week to bar a reporter from attending a White House event just because the White House didn't like the questions she asked, to the repeated labeling of the free press as enemies of the people. Watch the video last night, Mr. President. Watch the video in Florida last night where the president egged on his supporters to start screaming at his supporters to start screaming at newspaper reporters and other reporters, people who are doing their jobs. Reporters, in spite of this president using Stalinist language. I'm just reading a book right now, Mr. President, written by Stalin's translator. And this book talks about a lot of the language Stalin used. He called people enemies of the people. That's communist talk. That's Stalinist talk. Yet this president calls reporters who get up every day and do their jobs, most of them not paid very well, frankly, calls them enemies of the people. They do vital work, not just in Washington, but throughout the country. I'd like to take a moment to highlight one of them. I'm going to go to this floor every so often in the weeks and months ahead, and I'm going to talk about a local reporter, a reporter who gets up every day, probably doesn't make, Mr. President, more than $20,000 or $30,000 a year. In many cases, a little more than that, but reporters are generally not particularly well-paid people. And these important work that local Ohio journalists are doing, I want to talk about them. Some of them I've met, others I haven't met, but I've observed because I know how important they are to communities. I'll start doing this on a regular basis because in this town today, with this administration, with a president of the United States, I still can't believe a president of the United States engages in talk like Stalin, the Soviet Stalin, calling American citizens who get up every day and do their job to the best ability, that he calls them enemies of the people, and he tries to get the crowds he speaks to, the people he addresses, to chime in and call them enemies of the people and start calling these reporters names. But I want to talk about, this floor message that I'm going to do from time to time to be a constant reminder of how reporters contribute to their communities. Last week, the Daily Jeffersonian ran a story. The Daily Jeffersonian in Eastern Ohio ran a story on the upcoming Firemen's Festival in Caldwell, Ohio, a town in Appalachia, reported by a local reporter named Austin Erickson. It's the local fire department's biggest fundraiser of the year. They rely on the proceeds, in part because of the corruption in state government, where state government doesn't fund local communities like it used to for a whole bunch of reasons. But this fire department relies on the proceeds of the Firemen's Festival to fund daily maintenance, testing, and safety gear of their firefighters. Mr. Erickson talked to the festival's chairman, who, when talking to him, pointed to the fire department, told the reporter, if it's in those four walls, it's from that festival. In other words, if it weren't for this festival, we wouldn't have the fire equipment they need. Through its work, the Daily Jeffersonian and local reporters like Mr. Erickson are informing their communities about ways to support local fire responders and keep them safe. Mr. President, in a nutshell, if Mr. Erickson and the Daily Jeffersonian in Cambridge, Ohio, were not writing these stories, were not reporting on the Firemen's Festival, not as many people would go. Not as many people would understand that they spend their hard-earned money there. It helps their local community, helps their fire department. Enemies of the people. If the president would listen and see what these reporters do every day, maybe he'd stop the demagoguery. Maybe he'd stop calling people names. Maybe he'd stop calling his own attorney general names. Maybe he'd stand up to Putin, who clearly, that's a whole other story. I won't get into that. Let's go back to this local reporters. It's what journalists do every day, what Mr. Erickson does. It's what newspapers all over Ohio. From my hometown paper, the Mansfield News Journal, the paper where my wife used to work, the Cleveland Plain Dealer, the Columbus Dispatch, the Cincinnati Enquirer, smaller paper, the News Herald, the Lorraine Journal, I could go on and on and on. The Elyria Daily, paper after paper after paper. Journalists wake up every day. They do their jobs. They serve their communities. They serve their country. They're not enemies of the people. I would just pray to God the President of the United States would stop that kind of talk, Mr. President.